Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle, where the torches flicker along the walls, and you can almost hear the faint whistle of wind sneaking through cracks in heavy wooden doors. It's the kind of setting that looks romantic when you visit as a tourist, but if you had to actually live here, especially on a winter's night, you'd probably regret it before the first hour passed. The reality is, simple castles were freezing, and if you had to sleep inside one without central heating, insulated windows, or even a decent mattress by modern standards, you'd discover quickly that your biggest enemy wasn't rival knights, it was the cold. You probably won't survive this, at least not without learning a few medieval tricks that would make your ancestors proud and your heating bill jealous. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world people are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the flagstone floor of a great chamber, your boots scraping against surfaces worn smooth by centuries of feet. The cold bites at your skin even though you're fully dressed. These stone walls don't simply resist warmth, they swallow it whole. Historians often describe castles as marvels of defense, but rarely as marvels of comfort. And here's the blunt truth, those same thick walls that could shrug off a battering ram also trapped cold air like a giant medieval refrigerator. Once the sun dropped, the inside temperature plummeted almost as quickly as outside. You'd notice your breath forming clouds in front of your face, even indoors. The air feels heavy, damp, and unwelcoming. Castle architects thought brilliantly about moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits, but insulation wasn't exactly on their blueprints. They were building fortresses, not homes, and the difference showed every single night. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering is that many castles in northern Europe were strategically placed on windswept hills. From a military standpoint that was genius, you could see invaders coming, and the slopes gave defensive advantages. But from the perspective of someone trying to get some sleep, it was basically choosing to live inside a stone wind tunnel. The wind scoured every surface and forced icy drafts through gaps in shutters and under doors. You couldn't ask for a worse sleeping environment if you designed it specifically to torture insomniacs. Even the fireplaces couldn't save you, and castles had plenty of them. A roaring fire in the great hall barely warmed the immediate circle around it, and the further you moved from those flames, the more you felt like you were descending into a crypt. The heat simply couldn't compete with the thermal mass of all that stone. By the time you shuffled toward your bedchamber, often located in towers, for security reasons the temperature could feel more arctic than architectural. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Travelers' records from the late medieval period describe the shock of finding frost forming inside castle bedrooms, not outside the windows, inside the actual sleeping chambers. We're talking about ice crystals decorating the interior walls like nature's cruelest wallpaper. One Burgundian courtier wrote in 1387 about waking to find his wine cup frozen solid beside his bed. Another account mentions curtains so stiff with frost they cracked when pulled. Historians still argue whether this indoor frost was common or just happened during particularly brutal winters, but the documentation exists across multiple sources and centuries. The physics make sense too when you combine stone walls that conduct cold minimal heating and the humidity from people's breath. You create perfect conditions for indoor ice formation. The psychological impact was just as harsh as the physical discomfort. Medieval people understood that sleep was when you were most vulnerable, not just to enemies, but to the elements themselves. They developed an almost ritualistic approach to bedtime preparation, because carelessness could literally mean not waking up. Hypothermia was a genuine risk even for the wealthy. This is where you start to understand why medieval people took bed sharing so seriously, why they invested fortunes in tapestries and bed curtains, and why a warm room was considered one of life's greatest luxuries. They weren't being dramatic, they were being realistic about survival. Now picture yourself preparing for sleep in this stone fortress. The chamber stretches above you, vast and echoing, with shadows dancing in every corner that seem to mock your small human warmth. Your breath fogs as you move, and every step on the stone floor sends cold shooting up through your legs, like the building itself is trying to steal your body heat. The walls around you have absorbed centuries of winter nights, and they're not giving up their chill easily. You can hear the wind outside, but worse, you can feel it inside subtle drafts that find every gap in the stonework, every imperfect joint where mortar has cracked with age. The candle flames flicker nervously, creating a light show of moving shadows that makes the chamber feel even more alive with cold. This isn't just uncomfortable. This is a nightly battle for survival, and the battlefield is your own bedroom. Every night, medieval people had to win this battle or risk not seeing another dawn. Beneath all those blankets and curtains, the foundation of your night's rest was still the mattress itself. What lay under you could determine whether you passed the night in some level of comfort, or whether you woke aching, frozen, and wondering why your ancestors didn't just invent proper beds. In the Middle Ages, bedding came in many forms, but two stood out like class warfare made of fabric: the feather bed and the straw tick. The feather bed was the luxury choice, and when I say luxury, I mean the kind of extravagance that made peasants wonder if nobles had lost their minds. Imagine sinking into a massive sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft and pliable, cradling your body with a warmth that felt almost magical after a day in a stone refrigerator. Inventories from noble estates often list multiple feather beds, carefully stored and moved with the household whenever the lord travelled. These weren't just mattresses, they were portable comfort systems worth more than most people's annual income. The process of making a feather bed was an art form that would make modern mattress salespeople weep with envy. Servants would collect feathers from geese and ducks, but not just any feathers. The soft down from the breast area was prized above all else. These were sorted, cleaned, and stuffed into enormous linen sacks called ticks. A proper feather bed could take months to prepare, and required the feathers from dozens of birds. The result was something so soft and warm that chroniclers described it as sleeping on clouds, though clouds that cost more than a small village's tax contribution. But here's where it gets interesting. Even wealthy nobles didn't sleep directly on feather beds. That would be like using a Rolls-Royce as a grocery cart. Instead, they layered a straw mattress on top of the wooden bed frame, then placed the feather bed on top of that. Sometimes they added another feather bed on top, creating what modern historians call the medieval sandwich method of sleep engineering. You'd literally climb into bed the way you'd climb a small mountain. Now contrast this with the peasant experience. Straw ticks were the economy option, and by economy I mean whatever you could stuff into a sack without starving your livestock. Peasants gathered straw hay, dried grasses, sometimes even leaves or moss, and crammed it all into rough cloth bags. The result was scratchy, lumpy, and had a tendency to develop ecosystems of its own after a few months. Mice loved straw mattresses almost as much as their human owners, leading to some interesting midnight encounters. A quirky detail from manor records shows that straw mattresses were often communal property. When harvest time came around, families would empty their mattresses and use the old straw for other purposes: animal bedding, roof repairs, even kindling. Then they'd stuff fresh straw into the ticks, creating what was essentially an annual mattress renewal subscription. It was practical, but imagine explaining to guests that your bed was currently empty because the roof needed patching. The quality difference was astronomical. A feather bed provided insulation cushioning and actual warmth generation as your body heat got trapped in the down. A straw tick provided a barrier between you and the wooden planks, and if you were lucky it didn't poke through the fabric and stab you in the ribs all night. Historians still argue whether peasants genuinely got decent sleep on straw mattresses, or whether they just got used to being uncomfortable because they had no other choice. But here's what's fascinating: both types of mattresses shared one crucial feature: they were designed to be temporary and replaceable. Medieval people understood that bedding got dirty, infested, and worn out. Unlike modern mattresses that we treat like permanent installations, medieval beds were more like seasonal camping gear. You expected to remake, refill, or replace your sleeping surface regularly. The smell difference alone would shock modern sensibilities. Fresh straw had an earthy, almost sweet scent that many people found comforting. But old straw, let's just say it developed character. Featherbeds, meanwhile, could smell like wet birds when damp, which was often given the humidity in castle chambers. Some nobles tried to combat this by adding herbs, lavender, rosemary, or sweet woodruff, but the underlying aroma of feathers persisted. Picture yourself now climbing onto one of these medieval mattresses. If you're on a feather bed, you sink down into softness that seems to embrace your entire body, but you also feel the weight of the feathers shifting around you, creating valleys and hills as you move. The warmth is immediate and enveloping. If you're on a straw tick, you feel every individual straw through the fabric, creating a surface that's firm to the point of hostility. Every movement produces rustling sounds that could wake the dead, and you spend the first hour trying to find a position where nothing sharp is jabbing your spine. Both experiences taught medieval people that sleep was earned, not given. Whether you were sinking into down or wrestling with straw, your bed was a negotiation with discomfort, a compromise between what your body needed and what the world could provide. When you draw back the heavy curtains of a medieval four-poster bed, you aren't just peeking into someone's private sleeping space, you're stepping into a micro-world built for survival. These massive beds weren't furniture so much as they were architectural solutions to an architectural problem. If your bedroom was essentially a stone box designed to freeze you to death, then your bed needed to be a fortress within that fortress. Detailed inventories from noble households reveal just how seriously people took these sleeping machines. Unlike the simple pallets of peasants, four-poster beds rose off the ground, tall as a person carved from oak or walnut, that cost more than most people's houses. The posts stood like pillars, often ornately decorated with religious symbols or family crests, stretching upward to support a wooden canopy. That canopy wasn't decorative. It was the foundation of medieval climate control technology. By draping curtains down all four sides, you created what historians now call a microclimate chamber. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity trap. Your own body heat inside a fabric box, and suddenly an icy room becomes almost livable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a blanket fort, except built by master carpenters, and worth more than a small army's annual wages. Once those curtains were closed, the temperature difference could be dramatic. Your breath, your body, heat the warmth from thick bedding, all of it collected within that enclosed space. Outside the curtains, the chamber might hover just above freezing, but inside your fabric bubble, the temperature could climb 10 or 15 degrees higher. Those extra degrees represented the difference between miserable survival and something approaching actual rest. There's a well-documented record from a French duchess who travelled with her bed completely dismantled and packed on carts. Why go to that enormous trouble and expense? Because the bed wasn't just furniture, it was life support equipment. To sleep in an unfamiliar castle or abbey without your own canopy and curtains meant risking a night of shivering hell. The Duchess understood that comfort wasn't a luxury, it was survival technology that happened to look fancy. A curious detail that pops up in English sources describes curtains that were sometimes waxed or lined with oiled cloth to block drafts more effectively. Imagine pulling those curtains closed the fabric heavy and stiff, smelling faintly of beeswax or linseed oil. They didn't just block cold air, they created an almost waterproof seal that turned your bed into a personal climate chamber. The trade-off was that these treated curtains could feel clammy and smell like a candle shop, but when the alternative was hypothermia, people made peace with eau de beeswax. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical warmth. Medieval people lived in a world where privacy was almost non-existent. Great halls buzzed with activity chambers were shared with servants and guests, and personal space was a luxury most couldn't afford. But inside those bed curtains, you finally had a space that belonged entirely to you. The curtains' muffled sound blocked light and created the illusion of solitude in rooms that were rarely truly private. Modern scholars still debate how effective these beds really were at actual warming. Some argue the temperature difference was significant enough to prevent hypothermia and allow genuine rest. Others suggest the warmth was more psychological than physical. The feeling of being enclosed and protected mattered more than measurable temperature changes. Archaeological evidence supports both theories. The curtains were thick and layered enough to provide real insulation, but medieval people also wrote about the comfort of feeling hidden and safe even when still cold. What's certain is that people believed in their effectiveness so completely that portable bed ownership became a mark of noble necessity. Wealthy travellers expected to bring their own beds the way modern travellers expect clean sheets. The logistics were staggering: entire wagons dedicated to hauling bed frames, curtains, mattresses and linens from castle to castle. Picture yourself sliding into one of these medieval climate machines. The bed frame creaks under your weight as you climb up. These beds stood high enough that you needed a step stool to get in. The straw mattress rustles beneath the feather bed, and you can feel the soft give of down conforming to your body. Then comes the crucial moment, reaching for the curtain pull. As the heavy fabric slides closed around you, the change is immediate. The howling wind from the corridor becomes muffled, distant. The dancing shadows from the fireplace disappear, replaced by warm darkness. Your breath no longer fogs quite so dramatically, and the air feels less aggressive, less hostile to your presence. You're still cold, make no mistake about that, but you're cold inside a shelter rather than cold in the open wilderness of a stone chamber. The sound environment changes too. Inside the curtains you hear the rustle of fabric when you move, the soft settling of feathers, your own breathing. Outside the castle continues its nightly symphony of creaking wood, settling stone and whistling wind. But it all feels distant now, like weather happening to someone else. This is where you begin to understand that medieval sleep wasn't just about lying down. It was about engineering a habitable environment inside an uninhabitable one. Long before electric heating pads or hot water bottles, medieval people discovered that rocks could be their salvation against the bitter cold. The practice of heating stones for bed warmth became so common that it developed its own rituals, techniques, and unfortunately its own catalogue of burns and house fires. Welcome to the medieval world of portable heat, where a simple rock could mean the difference between sleep and a night-long battle with hypothermia. The process began hours before bedtime, usually around sunset when the day's cooking fires were still blazing. Someone in the household, often whichever unlucky child lost the evening's family negotiations, would select a flat, smooth stone about the size of a dinner plate. River rocks were preferred because they held heat longer and were less likely to crack under extreme temperature changes. The chosen stone would be placed directly into the heart of the fire, nestled among the coals, where it could absorb maximum heat. This wasn't a casual process. The stone needed to reach temperatures that would make modern safety inspectors faint with horror, hot enough to stay warm for hours, but not so hot that it would ignite whatever you wrapped it in. Medieval people developed an almost scientific understanding of thermal dynamics through trial and error, though the error part often involved singed eyebrows and emergency bucket brigades. After roasting for an hour or more, the stone became a glowing ember of concentrated heat. Retrieving it required tools that would make modern barbecue enthusiasts jealous: long iron tongs, wooden paddles, or simply a sturdy stick and nerves of steel. The goal was to fish out this blazing rock without dropping it on your foot, setting your clothes on fire, or accidentally creating what we might call an indoor lava situation. Once retrieved, the stone entered its transformation phase from dangerous heat source to cozy bed companion. The wrapping process was crucial and had to be done quickly before too much heat escaped. Old rags, worn-out clothing, sheep's wool, or even dried grass would be layered around the stone. Some households kept special cloths just for this purpose, thick wool that could handle extreme heat without combusting immediately. The wrapped stone would then be placed strategically in the bed, usually at the foot, where it could warm the entire sleeping area without risking direct contact with skin. A well-prepared hot stone could radiate warmth for 6 to 8 hours, essentially providing medieval central heating for your personal sleeping chamber. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly your bed transformed from an icy torture device into something approaching comfort. But here's where things get interesting from a social perspective. Hot stone preparation became a family affair with its own hierarchy and politics. The elderly and infants got first priority for the hottest stones, while healthy adults made do with whatever warmth remained. Children often competed for the honour of stone heating duty because it meant staying close to the fire longer, though they also bore the responsibility of not burning down the house. The risks were genuinely serious. Poorly wrapped stones could ignite bedding, creating what medieval records euphemistically called chamber fires. Underwrapped stones could cause severe burns, especially if they shifted during sleep and made contact with skin. Overwrapped stones lost their heat too quickly, defeating the entire purpose. Medieval people had to master a delicate balance between safety and effectiveness. Historians still debate whether this practice was more common among peasants or nobles. Evidence suggests both classes used heated stones, but in different ways. Wealthy families might have servants dedicated to stone preparation and could afford metal containers, early versions of bed warmers that made the process safer. Peasants relied on wrapping techniques and had to be more careful about fire safety in their timber and thatch homes. A quirky detail from monastery record shows that monks developed their own hot stone protocols. Since their religious schedule required midnight prayers, they often used smaller stones that would stay warm just long enough to get them through the coldest part of the night. Some monasteries assigned specific brothers to stone heating duties, creating what was essentially a medieval heating specialist position. The sensory experience of sleeping with a hot stone was unique and memorable. You'd feel the initial wave of warmth spreading up from your feet, gradually relaxing muscles that had been tense with cold all day. The stone created a warm zone that expanded slowly through the bedding, and your body would naturally curl toward that heat source, like a cat seeking sunshine. Picture yourself now in this medieval heating ritual. You've watched the stone glow in the fire until it looks like a piece of captured sunset. You've carefully wrapped it in layers of wool, feeling the heat radiating through the fabric like a small sun in your hands. As you place it in your bed, the immediate area around it becomes an oasis of warmth in an otherwise hostile sleeping environment. The stone doesn't just warm your body, it warms your spirits. In a world where cold was a constant enemy, having this pocket of reliable heat felt like a small victory against the elements. You drift off to sleep with your feet finally comfortable, knowing that even if the fire in the hearth died completely, you'd still have hours of warmth radiating from this simple rock that had become your nighttime companion. The bare stone walls of a medieval castle were not just cold, they were actively hostile to human comfort, sucking warmth from the air and radiating chill like massive refrigerator panels. But medieval people weren't helpless against this architectural assault. They developed an ingenious counterattack using what we now call tapestries, though calling them mere decoration misses their true purpose as survival technology disguised as art. When you walked into a properly appointed noble chamber, you weren't just seeing luxury, you were witnessing medieval climate engineering. Those magnificent woven hangings that covered every available wall surface served as the period's answer to insulation. Heavy wool tapestries, thick linen hangings, and even simple cloth panels created an air gap between the stone and the living space, trapping warmer air in a buffer zone that could make the difference between miserable and tolerable. The physics were surprisingly sophisticated. Stone walls conducted cold from outside like thermal highways, but hanging fabric a few inches away from the surface interrupted that heat transfer. The air trapped between cloth and stone acted as insulation, while the textile itself absorbed and held whatever warmth existed in the room. A chamber lined with tapestries could be several degrees warmer than bare stone, and in medieval terms those few degrees represented the margin between comfort and suffering. But this wasn't just about hanging any old cloth on the walls. Medieval households invested enormous resources in wall coverings specifically designed for thermal efficiency. The wealthiest families commissioned tapestries woven with multiple layers, creating thick barriers that combined beauty with function. These weren't the delicate museum pieces we see today, they were robust working textiles, designed to survive years of fighting cold and damp. A fascinating inventory from the Duke of Burgundy's household in 1420 lists different tapestries designated for winter and summer use. The winter hangings were described as thick woven and double-backed, while summer versions were lighter and designed more for decoration than insulation. This seasonal textile strategy shows how seriously medieval people took the relationship between fabric and survival. Historians still argue about the actual effectiveness of tapestry insulation. Some insist the thermal benefits were significant enough to justify the enormous expense these hangings could cost more than a small castle. Others argue the improvement was largely psychological, that walking into a chamber draped in rich colours and soft textures felt warmer, even if the actual temperature barely changed. The truth probably lies somewhere between, but what matters is that medieval people believed so firmly in textile insulation that they made it a cornerstone of domestic architecture. The installation process was an art form in itself. Tapestries weren't simply nailed to walls like modern wallpaper, they were hung on wooden frames or iron rods that held them away from the stone surface, maximizing the insulating air gap. Servants spent hours arranging these hangings to eliminate drafts and ensure complete wall coverage. The goal was to create a textile shell inside the stone shell, a room within a room that human bodies could actually warm. Peasant families couldn't afford woven masterpieces, but they understood the same principles. Rough wool cloth, patched blankets, even animal hides were hung along walls to reduce drafts and create thermal barriers. These improvised wall coverings might lack artistic merit, but they served the same essential function, transforming stone prisons into spaces where human life could persist. A quirky detail from English household accounts shows that some families use specialized summer storage for their heavy tapestries. During warm months, these massive textile insulation systems were carefully cleaned, treated with herbs to prevent moth damage, and stored in cedar chests. Come autumn, the household would essentially re-insulate itself by hanging the winter tapestries, creating an annual ritual of weatherproofing that involved the entire domestic staff. The sensory transformation was as important as the thermal one. Bare stone walls created harsh acoustics that made every sound echo coldly through the chamber. Covered walls absorbed sound, creating softer, more intimate acoustic environments that felt warmer even beyond the actual temperature change. The visual impact was equally psychological. Rich colours and detailed scenes replaced the grey monotony of stone, creating spaces that felt alive rather than tomb-like. Picture yourself entering a chamber in the depths of winter, first bare and then properly draped. In the bare room, your footsteps echo sharply off hard surfaces, your breath clouds immediately, and the grey stone seems to pull warmth from your body through your eyes. But step into the same space hung with tapestries and everything changes. The sound of your movement becomes muffled and intimate. The walls glow with colour and life. The air itself feels less aggressive, less eager to steal your body heat. You run your hand along a tapestry and feel thick wool that's absorbed some warmth from the room. Behind it you can sense the cold stone, but it feels distant now, separated from your living space by this textile barrier. The hanging moves slightly as you touch it, revealing the air gap behind that's doing its quiet work of thermal protection. This is where you begin to understand that medieval interior design wasn't about aesthetics. It was about creating habitable spaces inside uninhabitable structures. Every beautiful hanging was also a tool for survival, every decorative choice a calculated move in the ongoing war against cold. The nobles who surrounded themselves with tapestries weren't just displaying wealth. They were building the medieval equivalent of insulated walls, one gorgeous, expensive thread at a time. In a world where individual warmth was a luxury few could afford, medieval people discovered that the most effective heating system was other people. The practice of communal sleeping wasn't born from social customs or lack of privacy. It was pure survival mathematics. Bodies generated heat, and in the brutal arithmetic of medieval winters, more bodies meant better odds of seeing another dawn. The great shared sleep took many forms, but all followed the same basic principle: pack as many warm-blooded creatures as possible into the smallest defensible space. In peasant homes, entire families crowded onto single sleeping areas. Children nestled between parents like human insulation layers. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and even visiting neighbours might join this nightly huddle, creating what modern anthropologists call communal thermal regulation, but what medieval people simply called staying alive. The logistics were more complex than just throwing everyone onto a pile of straw. Families developed sophisticated sleeping hierarchies based on thermal contribution and vulnerability. Infants and elderly members claimed the centre positions where they received maximum warmth from surrounding bodies. Pregnant women and the sick also merited prime real estate in the thermal landscape. Healthy adults formed the outer layers, their bodies serving as living blankets for the more vulnerable members. But humans weren't the only participants in this survival strategy. Animals became essential partners in the great shared sleep. Dogs were particularly prized as bed companions because they generated steady heat, stayed relatively still during sleep, and provided the added benefit of alerting to midnight dangers. Cats, despite their smaller size, were valued for their ability to detect and eliminate vermin that might otherwise share the sleeping space in less welcome ways. A fascinating account from a 14th century English manor describes a winter so harsh that the lord's family abandoned their private chambers and moved into the kitchen with the servants sharing sleeping space around the great hearth. Class distinctions temporarily dissolved in the face of thermal necessity. The same record notes that the household dogs normally banned from noble sleeping areas were welcomed as essential heating partners during this crisis. Historians still debate whether this communal sleeping was primarily a lower-class phenomenon, or if wealthy families also practiced it during extreme conditions. Evidence suggests that while nobles had more options for individual warmth, they weren't above strategic bed sharing when survival demanded it. Medieval marriage beds were often designed to accommodate more than 2 people, not for scandalous reasons, but because adding a servant or child to the sleeping arrangement could provide crucial additional warmth. The sensory experience of communal sleeping was intense and unforgettable. Imagine settling into a shared sleeping space where every movement creates a ripple effect through multiple bodies. You hear the breathing of family members, the shifting of straw, the occasional snore or murmur. The air becomes thick with the combined warmth and smell of multiple bodies, not unpleasant in the context of survival, but undeniably intimate in ways that modern privacy standards would find shocking. Temperature regulation became a group effort requiring coordination and consideration. If one person hogged blankets or sprawled too widely, the entire thermal system suffered. Medieval people developed sleeping etiquette that prioritized the group's warmth over individual comfort. Moving too much was considered antisocial. Leaving the shared sleeping area during the night for any reason required careful planning to minimize heat loss for those remaining. A quirky detail from monastery records shows that even religious communities with their emphasis on individual contemplation modified their sleeping arrangements during harsh winters. Monks were sometimes permitted to share cells or sleep in common areas around braziers, their usual vows of solitude temporarily suspended in favour of collective survival. Some monasteries developed winter dormitories specifically designed for communal sleeping during the coldest months. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical warmth. In a world where death was a constant possibility, and winter nights felt like battles against hostile forces, sleeping surrounded by family created profound feelings of security and connection. The shared sleep reinforced social bonds and created shared vulnerability that strengthened community ties. You literally depended on each other for warmth, and that dependence fostered mutual care and protection. Children growing up in this system learned early that survival was a collective effort. They understood that their comfort depended on others' well-being, and that their own body heat was a contribution to family survival. This created social values that prioritized group welfare over individual desires, attitudes that shaped medieval community life far beyond sleeping arrangements. Picture yourself now joining this medieval thermal community. You approach the sleeping area where your family has already begun settling for the night. There's a practiced choreography to the arrangement. Everyone knows their position, their role in the thermal architecture. You slide into your designated space, feeling immediately the warmth radiating from the bodies around you. Your brother shifts to make room, and you feel his shoulder against yours. Your sister on the other side murmurs something in her half-sleep and unconsciously shares her blanket edge. The family dog settles against your feet, a warm weight that immediately begins to chase away the cold that's been following you all day. This isn't just sleeping, it's joining a living, breathing heating system powered by love necessity, and the simple biological fact that warm bodies create more warmth when they stick together. The cold night wind might howl outside, and the stone walls might radiate their endless chill, but here in this cluster of shared warmth, winter feels manageable. Your breathing begins to sync with those around you, and the collective rise and fall of multiple chests creates a rhythm that rocks you towards sleep. You're not just falling asleep, you're joining a communal act of survival that's as old as human civilization itself. You might think that once a bed was established in a noble chamber, it stayed put like a piece of architectural permanence. But medieval people were seasonal nomads within their own homes, constantly chasing pockets of warmth and fleeing zones of unbearable cold. Bedrooms weren't fixed sanctuaries. They were tactical positions in an ongoing war against the elements, and smart families moved their sleeping arrangements like generals repositioning troops. The practice of seasonal bed migration was so common that castle inventories regularly tracked which chambers were in use versus closed for winter. Some castles maintained entirely separate winter and summer sleeping quarters, not because people wanted variety in their decor, but because the physics of solar heating and wind patterns made certain rooms uninhabitable during specific seasons. You literally followed the sun through your own house, setting up temporary camps wherever warmth was most likely to accumulate. Winter sleeping strategy focused obsessively on southern exposure. Families abandoned grand chambers with northern views and crowded into smaller rooms where weak winter sunlight might penetrate for a few precious hours each day. Even pale December sunshine striking stone walls could raise the temperature by several degrees a difference that meant everything when you were already operating at the margins of survivability. Those sun-warmed stones would continue radiating heat for hours after sunset, extending the benefit well into the night. There's a well-documented example from Edward the Thaw's household accounts showing the massive logistical effort involved in seasonal bed movements. Entire teams of servants spent days dismantling four-poster beds, rolling up tapestries, packing feather mattresses, and hauling everything to new chambers. The king's bed alone required 16 men to move, and that didn't include the curtains, linens, and specialized furniture that travelled with it. This wasn't royal eccentricity. It was survival engineering at the highest level. Come summer, the migration reversed with equal urgency. Those sunny southern chambers that provided salvation in winter became unbearable ovens when the sun climbed high and stayed long. Families fled to north-facing rooms seeking spaces that remained cool and dim during the blazing months. The same chambers that felt like refuges in January became punishment cells in July, demonstrating just how dramatically seasonal conditions could transform the livability of medieval spaces. A curious note survives from a Burgundian courtier who wrote to his brother about losing his chamber to the frost. The walls, he explained, had grown so damp and cold that he refused to sleep there anymore, choosing instead a narrower room facing the rising sun. His phrasing reveals how people thought about these spaces rooms could be conquered by cold, surrendered to winter, and eventually retaken when conditions improved. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice was among different social classes. Wealthy families clearly had the resources and servants to execute major furniture relocations, but evidence suggests that even peasant families practiced smaller-scale seasonal migrations within their single-room homes. They might move sleeping areas closer to or farther from the hearth, or shift pallets to take advantage of specific wall orientations and roof angles that affected thermal dynamics. The psychological impact of these moves was significant beyond the physical comfort. Changing sleeping locations mark the passage of seasons in visceral, immediate ways. When your family began discussing the autumn bed migration, you knew winter was truly coming. When spring arrangements started, hope returned along with longer days. Your sleeping space became a calendar that tracked the year's progress through your body's relationship with warmth and cold, Servants developed expertise in reading the thermal personality of different chambers. They learned which rooms warmed first in morning sun, which held heat longest after sunset, and which orientations provided the best compromise between winter warmth and summer cooling. This knowledge was valuable enough that experienced chamber servants could command higher wages. They weren't just cleaning and arranging furniture, they were managing sophisticated climate control systems. The logistics of these moves required careful planning and timing. You couldn't wait until the chamber became uninhabitable to start relocating. By then, the conditions for moving heavy furniture safely became dangerous. Smart households began migrations at the first signs of seasonal change, creating a constant low-level shuffle of bedding and belongings that marked the rhythm of medieval domestic life. Picture yourself participating in one of these seasonal migrations. It's early October and you can feel the autumn chill beginning to penetrate your current chamber, despite the tapestries and braziers. Your family has decided it's time to move to the winter quarters, a smaller room with a massive fireplace and windows facing southeast to catch whatever weak sunshine winter might provide. You help servants dismantle the great bed, carefully wrapping the feather mattresses in protective cloth and rolling up the precious tapestries that have lined your walls. The chamber you're leaving feels already abandoned, cold air rushing in to claim the space as soon as the warm textiles are removed. But the room you're moving toward promises salvation, thick walls on 3 sides to block wind windows positioned to capture every possible ray of winter sun. As the bed is reassembled in its new location, you can immediately sense the difference. This chamber feels more defensible against the coming cold, more likely to hold and multiply whatever warmth you can generate. The move isn't just about changing bedrooms, it's about positioning yourself strategically for the months-long siege that winter represents. You're not just sleeping in a different room, you're relocating to a more favourable battlefield in the ongoing war between human comfort and natural hostility. The migration complete, you test the new sleeping arrangement and feel the subtle ways this chamber promises better odds of survival. The winter campaign is about to begin, but you've chosen your ground wisely. Picture yourself not in a familiar castle this time, but on the road, far from known chambers and trusted beds. Medieval travel was slow, arduous, and when night fell, the problem of staying warm became a desperate gamble, with strangers' fleas and accommodations that made castle chambers seem luxurious by comparison. Welcome to the world of medieval inns, where sleep was less about rest and more about surviving until dawn, in rooms that redefine the concept of shared space. The medieval inn was not the cosy picture postcard establishment you might imagine from romantic novels. Instead, it was often a timber frame building with a smoky main hall, crowded sleeping chambers, and an approach to hygiene that would horrify modern health inspectors. But for travellers caught by nightfall miles from any castle or monastery, these establishments provided one crucial service shelter that might keep you alive until morning, assuming you could navigate the complex social dynamics of communal sleeping. Guests weren't assigned private rooms, that concept didn't exist for most travellers. Instead, you'd be directed to a large chamber where multiple beds accommodated anywhere from 4 to 8 people each. Strangers packed together like cargo sharing not just mattresses but blankets, body heat, and unfortunately whatever parasites they'd picked up during their journeys. Privacy was a luxury that ended the moment you crossed the inn's threshold. The sleeping arrangements followed a rough hierarchy based on ability to pay and social status. Merchants who could afford premium rates might secure spots on actual beds with straw mattresses and wool blankets. Poorer travellers found themselves relegated to floor pallets or benches near the fire, grateful for any shelter, but resigned to nights of minimal warmth and maximum discomfort. Servants often slept in stables with the horses, which, given the body heat generated by large animals, might actually have been warmer than the human accommodations. A fascinating account from a 15th century merchant describes the protocol for inn-sleeping that reveals just how regulated these arrangements had become. New arrivals were assigned sleeping positions by the innkeeper based on their apparent wealth, profession, and the order of their arrival. Arguments over bed placement were common enough that many inns developed formal systems for rotating positions, ensuring that no single traveller monopolised the warmest spots night after night. But here's where inn-sleeping became truly challenging. You were sharing intimate space with complete strangers who might be carrying diseases, harbouring criminal intentions, or simply possessing personal hygiene standards that would make a stable hand gag. Medieval people were accustomed to close quarters, but inn-sleeping pushed the boundaries of tolerance. You'd drift off listening to the snores, coughs, and mysterious rustling sounds of people whose names you didn't know, and whose trustworthiness you could only guess. The thermal dynamics of inn-sleeping created their own unique survival strategies. Bodies packed together generated significant heat, but they also created competition for blankets and optimal positions. The edge of a shared bed might be drafty and cold, while the centre could become stifling and claustrophobic. Experienced travellers learned to negotiate these thermal politics carefully. Too aggressive in claiming space, and you'd make enemies. Too passive, and you'd freeze. Historians still debate whether inn accommodations were genuinely safer than sleeping outdoors. The shelter provided protection from weather and wild animals, but the concentration of strangers created different risks. Theft was common disease, transmission was inevitable, and violent conflicts over sleeping arrangements sometimes ended in bloodshed. Some travellers chose to sleep in their clothes with their money pouches clutched tightly, turning every night into an exercise in cautious paranoia. The sensory experience of inn-sleeping was overwhelming and memorable. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, damp wool, and whatever food had been served in the common room. You'd hear a symphony of human sounds, snoring, coughing, whispering, and the constant rustle of people trying to find comfortable positions on inadequate bedding. The combination of warmth from multiple bodies and the anxiety of sleeping among strangers created a uniquely medieval form of insomnia. A quirky detail from inn records shows that some establishments developed reputations for specific types of guests. Pilgrim inns catered to religious travellers and maintained slightly higher cleanliness standards. Merchant inns focused on protecting valuable goods and might offer more secure sleeping arrangements. Soldier inns. Well, let's just say they prioritised quantity over quality and expected their guests to handle their own security arrangements. The morning ritual at medieval inns was as chaotic as the evening arrangements. Guests would wake at different times depending on their travel schedules, creating a constant churn of people, rising, dressing, and departing in the pre-dawn darkness. The lucky ones who'd secured spots near windows could use natural light to check their belongings and prepare for departure. Others dressed by firelight and hoped they hadn't accidentally grabbed someone else's possessions in the confusion. Picture yourself now approaching one of these medieval inns as darkness falls and the temperature plummets. You're cold, exhausted, and facing the prospect of another night exposed to winter weather if you can't secure shelter. The inn's main hall glows with firelight and promises warmth, but you know the price will be more than just coins. It will be a night of negotiating space, tolerating strangers, and hoping that dawn finds you with your belongings and health intact. You enter the common room where other travellers are already settling in for the night. The innkeeper assigns you a portion of a bed that you'll share with 3 merchants from different towns, none of whom speak your dialect particularly well. The mattress is thin, the blankets are questionable, and your bedmates have hygiene standards that suggest soap is still a theoretical concept in their regions. But as you settle into this chaotic sleeping arrangement, you feel the immediate benefit of shared body heat. The merchants might be strangers with dubious personal habits, but their warm bodies are turning the cold bed into something approaching livable. You negotiate blanket territories, establish silent agreements about personal space, and eventually drift towards sleep surrounded by the breathing, snoring, and occasional muttering of people who for this one night are your survival partners in the ongoing battle against winter's chill. Close your eyes and imagine waking in the dim grey of a medieval dawn, your breath immediately fogging in the frigid air of your chamber. But this isn't just morning cold, this is something far more unsettling. As your eyes adjust to the pale light filtering through shutters, you realise that delicate crystalline patterns have formed along the interior walls of your bedroom. Ice, inside your sleeping chamber. Winter hasn't just conquered the world outside your castle, it's invaded your most private sanctuary and decorated it with nature's cruelest artwork. This wasn't a rare occurrence that happened only during legendary winters. Medieval records from across northern Europe document the regular formation of frost inside castle bedrooms, monastery cells, and even royal chambers. We're talking about ice crystals forming on interior walls, water basins freezing solid beside beds, and curtains becoming so stiff with frost that they cracked when touched. One Burgundian courtier wrote in 1387 about waking to find his wine cup frozen solid beside his bed. The liquid expanded and split the pewter vessel. The physics behind indoor frost formation reveal just how brutal medieval living conditions really were. When you combine stone walls that conduct cold like thermal highways, minimal heating systems, and the humidity created by human breathing, you create perfect conditions for ice formation inside living spaces. The moisture from your breath, the steam from washing water, even the dampness in poorly dried clothing, all of it could freeze overnight when temperatures plummeted and heating systems failed. But here's what makes this phenomenon particularly disturbing. The frost often formed in beautiful, intricate patterns that medieval people began to interpret as omens or messages. Some saw religious symbols in the ice formations and interpreted them as divine communications. Others believed that certain frost patterns predicted weather changes or warned of approaching dangers. What we now understand as simple crystallization physics became in medieval minds a form of supernatural writing on their bedroom walls. A fascinating account from an English abbey describes monks who developed detailed catalogues of frost patterns and their supposed meanings. Straight-line formations predicted harsh weather, continuing while curved patterns suggested a break in the cold. Frost that formed in cross shapes was considered particularly auspicious, while chaotic branching patterns were thought to warn of troubles ahead. The monks assigned novices to study and record these formations, creating what amounts to medieval frost fortune-telling manuals. Historians still debate how common indoor frost actually was, versus how much medieval chroniclers exaggerated for dramatic effect. Archaeological evidence from castle ruins shows wall construction that would have conducted enormous amounts of cold, suggesting that interior ice formation was physically inevitable during severe weather. But some scholars argue that accounts of wine freezing beside beds and curtains cracking with ice might represent exceptional rather than typical conditions. The psychological impact was perhaps more devastating than the physical discomfort. Medieval people understood cold as a natural enemy, but when frost began forming inside their most protected spaces, it felt like a betrayal of the basic human ability to create shelter. Your bedroom was supposed to be your final refuge against winter's assault, and seeing ice claim that space challenged fundamental assumptions about safety and security. Children growing up with indoor frost developed a relationship with winter that modern people can barely comprehend. They learned to check for ice formation as part of their morning routine, scraping frost from wash basins and testing curtains for brittleness before attempting to open them. Some families developed rituals around indoor frost prayers for warmer nights, games of identifying patterns in ice formations or competitions to see who could endure the coldest sleeping conditions without complaint. The practical consequences were serious beyond the psychological effects. Frozen water meant no washing until you could melt ice over a fire. Stiff curtains could tear if handled roughly, destroying expensive bed hangings that families couldn't afford to replace. Frost formation on walls indicated such extreme cold that hypothermia became a genuine risk, even for people sleeping under multiple layers of covers. Wealthy families developed counter-strategies that reveal how seriously they took the indoor frost threat. Some castle chambers were equipped with multiple braziers that servants tended throughout the night specifically to prevent ice formation. Others used heated stones, not just for personal warmth, but to create warm zones that would discourage frost from forming on nearby surfaces. The most desperate measures included having servants sleep in rotation near important items, water basins, wine supplies, valuable textiles to prevent them from freezing. A quirky detail from monastery records shows that some religious communities actually embraced indoor frost as a form of spiritual discipline. They interpreted the ice formations as reminders of life's hardships, and used them as inspiration for prayers about endurance and faith. These monks would deliberately avoid using braziers or heated stones, choosing instead to accept whatever frost formed as part of their spiritual practice. Whether this represented genuine devotion or elaborate rationalization of poverty, the records don't specify. Picture yourself now in this surreal medieval morning scenario. You wake surrounded by the familiar comfort of your bed curtains, but as you push them aside, the chamber reveals its icy transformation. Delicate frost flowers bloom across the stone walls like frozen gardens. Your water basin has become a solid block of ice, and the tapestries hang stiff with crystalline coating that makes them look like frozen waterfalls. Your first breath outside the bed curtain stings your lungs with cold so sharp it feels like swallowing knives. Every surface in the room radiates chill, and you realize that during the night, winter didn't just visit your chamber, it moved in and redecorated according to its own aesthetic preferences. The frost patterns catch what little light filters through the shutters, creating an eerie beauty that's both magical and deeply unsettling. This is the moment when medieval people faced their daily choice surrender to the ice and retreat back under covers, or begin the arduous process of reclaiming their living space from winter's overnight conquest. Either way, you understand viscerally that you're not just living in a cold building, you're cohabiting with winter itself, sharing your most intimate spaces with an elemental force that transforms your bedroom into its personal art gallery every single night. The medieval night revealed the stark mathematics of survival, and nowhere was this calculation more brutally clear than in the contrast between how nobles and peasants managed the endless battle against cold. While both groups faced the same merciless physics of winter, their strategies, resources, and ultimate comfort levels differed so dramatically that they might as well have been living in different centuries. Yet in some surprising ways, the humblest cottage sometimes offered warmer sleep than the grandest castle chamber. Let's start with the obvious advantages of wealth. A noble's bedchamber was an arsenal of thermal warfare that peasants could only dream of accessing. Multiple feather beds stacked like luxury sandwiches, curtains thick enough to stop drafts, tapestries covering every stone surface, and servants whose entire job was maintaining optimal sleeping temperatures. Wealthy families could afford to heat stones in multiple fireplaces, maintain braziers throughout the night, and replace bedding regularly to ensure maximum insulation efficiency. The sheer volume of textiles available to noble families created thermal environments that operated on completely different principles than peasant sleeping arrangements. Where a peasant family might own 1 or 2 blankets, total noble inventories list dozens of coverlets, quilts, furs, and specialized winter bedding. A duke's bed might be buried under wolf pelts, bear furs, goose down comforters, and wool blankets heavy enough to require assistance to arrange properly. The weight alone created insulation that trapped body heat with scientific efficiency. But here's where the story gets complicated. Nobles often slept alone, or with minimal bed companions, which meant their magnificent beds had to be warmed by individual body heat rather than the collective thermal power of multiple people. A peasant family of 6 or 8 people sharing a single straw mattress generated significantly more warmth than a lone lord buried under expensive furs. The physics of human heating favored quantity over quality, and peasant families had quantity in abundance. Peasant sleeping arrangements operated on principles of thermal efficiency that wealthy people couldn't replicate even if they wanted to. Entire extended families crowded into single rooms where collective body heat combined with the warmth from animals who shared the living space created surprisingly effective heating systems. The family cow, several chickens, a couple of dogs, and 8 human bodies in one small room generated enough heat to raise the temperature by 15 or 20 degrees above the outdoor temperature. A fascinating detail from manor court records shows disputes between peasant families over animal sleeping arrangements. One family sued their neighbours for stealing our cow's warmth, when boundary disputes forced them to move their livestock to a different part of their dwelling. The legal argument centered on which family had traditional rights to position their animals for optimal household heating, a conflict that reveals how seriously peasants took thermal strategy. The architectural differences also created surprising thermal trade-offs. Castle chambers were vast drafty spaces that required enormous amounts of heat to warm effectively. Even with roaring fires and multiple braziers, much of that heat simply disappeared into the stone and timber vastness above. Peasant homes were small, low-ceiling spaces where any heat generated stayed concentrated around the people who needed it most. A modest fire in a peasant hearth could warm the entire dwelling, while a massive castle fireplace might barely heat the immediate area around it. Historians still debate which sleeping situation was actually more comfortable during harsh winters. Records suggest that during extreme cold, some nobles abandoned their grand chambers and moved into smaller spaces, sometimes even joining servants in kitchen areas to take advantage of more efficient heating arrangements. This suggests that wealth could provide luxury, but couldn't always guarantee warmth, especially when architectural grandeur worked against thermal efficiency. The psychological comfort levels varied just as dramatically. Nobles had privacy, personal space, and the security of knowing they owned their sleeping arrangements. But they also bore the burden of maintaining complex heating systems and managing servants responsible for their thermal comfort. Peasants had no privacy and minimal personal space, but they also had the security of shared warmth and collective responsibility for everyone's survival. Food availability also affected sleeping comfort in ways that crossed class boundaries. Well-fed bodies generated more heat and maintained temperature better than hungry ones. Nobles typically had adequate nutrition, but peasants during good harvest years could also maintain healthy body weight that improved their natural heating capacity. During famine years, however, even wealthy families might struggle with thermal regulation, as their bodies became less efficient at generating and maintaining warmth. A quirky observation from a travelling monk's diary describes staying in both noble castles and peasant homes during the same winter journey. He noted that while the castle beds were infinitely more comfortable and luxurious, he often woke warmer in peasant cottages where he slept surrounded by families and their animals. His conclusion was that God had provided the poor with heating systems that money couldn't buy, namely each other. Picture yourself experiencing both ends of this medieval thermal spectrum in a single night. First, you're in the grand chamber of a wealthy lord, buried under layers of expensive furs and fine wool, surrounded by tapestries and warmed by carefully tended braziers. The bed is soft, the privacy absolute, the luxury undeniable. But you're also alone with all that magnificence, and your single body struggles to warm the enormous bed and vast chamber. Later imagine yourself in a peasant cottage where you're packed onto a straw mattress with 6 other family members, 2 dogs and the comforting presence of livestock in the next room. The mattress is scratchy, the privacy non-existent, the smell overwhelming. But you're also surrounded by warmth from every direction, human bodies, animal heat, and the efficient circulation of air warmed by collective breathing and shared fires. Both experiences teach the same medieval lesson: survival trumped comfort, and warmth came in many forms. Whether you achieved it through wealth, or community through luxury or necessity, the goal remained the same: wake up alive in the morning. The path to that goal simply looked very different depending on which side of the social divide you occupied. When nature called during a medieval winter night, the response was less, "Excuse me for a moment," and more, "I'm about to embark on a potentially life-threatening expedition that may require prayers and possibly a search party if I don't return within a reasonable time." The journey from warm bed to outdoor latrine represented one of the most dreaded aspects of medieval nighttime survival, a trek that combined physical danger, extreme discomfort, and the very real possibility of not making it back alive. Medieval toilet facilities were not conveniently located down the hall from your bedroom. Instead, they were strategically positioned as far as possible from living spaces to manage the obvious hygiene and odour issues, which meant that answering nature's call required leaving the relative safety and warmth of your chamber and venturing into the hostile darkness of courtyards, gardens, or castle baileys. In winter, this journey became an Arctic expedition requiring careful planning and considerable courage. The typical medieval privy was an outdoor structure built over a pit stream or castle wall opening that allowed waste to fall away from the living areas. Some castle latrines were built into walls with chutes that dropped waste into moats or rivers below, while peasant families often shared community latrines located at the edges of villages. What they all had in common was their distance from sleeping areas and their complete lack of heating, lighting, or weather protection. Getting dressed for a midnight bathroom expedition was an art form in itself. You couldn't simply throw on a robe and shuffle down a heated hallway. Instead, you had to bundle up as if preparing for outdoor winter travel, because that's exactly what you were doing. Heavy cloaks, fur-lined boots, gloves, and often additional layers were essential just to survive the journey, let alone accomplish your biological mission and return safely. The lighting situation added another layer of complexity and danger. Carrying candles or oil lamps in winter wind was challenging enough, but the combination of open flames, flowing garments, and icy paths created serious fire hazards. Some people opted to navigate by moonlight or starlight when available, but cloudy winter nights meant stumbling through complete darkness while trying to find outdoor structures that weren't exactly marked with helpful signage. A fascinating account from a monastery chronicle describes the night office of necessity, that some religious communities developed around winter bathroom expeditions. Monks would travel in pairs during the harshest weather, with one person carrying a lantern and the other providing backup navigation and emergency assistance. The arrangement was practical, but also reflected how seriously medieval people took the risks involved in these seemingly simple journeys. Historians still debate how often people simply chose to avoid the entire expedition by using chamber pots or other indoor alternatives. Wealthy households often maintained pot cupboards, small chambers with removable containers that could be emptied by servants during daylight hours. But even chamber pots required someone to venture outside eventually, and servants faced the same dangerous conditions when disposing of waste in outdoor facilities. The psychological impact of these midnight expeditions was significant beyond the physical challenges. Medieval people already lived with constant awareness of nighttime dangers, wild animals, bandits, supernatural threats, and simply getting lost in familiar areas that looked completely different in darkness, adding the urgency of biological necessity and the disorientation of extreme cold created anxiety that could keep people awake worrying about when they might need to make the journey. Children face particular challenges with winter bathroom expeditions. Parents had to balance the risks of allowing small children to venture outside alone against the dangers of accompanying them and leaving other family members unprotected. Some families developed elaborate systems of ropes or bells that children could follow or ring if they became lost or encountered trouble during their outdoor missions. The return journey often proved more treacherous than the outbound trip. After accomplishing their biological mission in freezing temperatures, people faced the challenge of navigating back to their chambers while their bodies were already chilled and their coordination potentially compromised by cold. Slipping on icy paths, losing direction in darkness, or simply moving too slowly and risking hypothermia were genuine concerns that turned every bathroom break into a survival challenge. A quirky detail from castle household accounts shows that some wealthy families employed gong farmers, servants whose specific job was maintaining and cleaning latrines. These workers developed expertise in winter latrine safety and sometimes provided escort services for family members during particularly harsh weather. The position was considered among the least desirable household jobs, but it was also essential enough to command higher wages than basic servant positions. Weather conditions could make outdoor bathroom facilities completely inaccessible for days at a time. Heavy snowfall, ice storms, or extreme wind could block access to latrines or make the journey so dangerous that families had to rely entirely on indoor alternatives until conditions improved. Medieval people became experts at reading weather signs and planning their biological schedules around approaching storms. Picture yourself now facing this medieval midnight dilemma. You've been lying in your warm bed for hours, but biology has finally overcome comfort and you realize the journey can no longer be postponed. You begin the elaborate process of bundling up for what amounts to an Arctic expedition to accomplish something that takes modern people 30 seconds in a heated bathroom down the hall. You slide out from under your pile of covers and immediately feel the shock of chamber air that's barely above freezing. Every movement now is about thermal conservation, as you wrap yourself in cloaks and furs, searching for gloves and trying to prepare a light source that won't blow out in the wind. The door to the outside represents a portal to a landscape that views your biological needs as an excellent opportunity to kill you through exposure. Opening that door feels like stepping into another world entirely, one where the cold immediately begins stealing your body heat, where familiar paths have become invisible obstacles, and where the simple act of finding an outdoor toilet becomes a navigation challenge worthy of Arctic explorers. You understand viscerally why medieval people planned their liquid intake carefully in the evening hours, and why chamber pots, despite their obvious drawbacks, represented a genuine innovation in medieval comfort technology. In the hierarchical world of medieval sleeping arrangements, the hearth wasn't just the heart of the home, it was the centre of a complex social system that determined who lived and who might not survive the night. The politics of fire management and sleeping position created invisible maps of family status, age, privilege, and survival priority that governed every aspect of nighttime arrangements. Understanding these thermal politics reveals how medieval families organized themselves around the fundamental reality that heat meant life. The positioning around a household fire followed rules as rigid as any royal court protocol. Infants and the elderly claim the prime real estate closest to the flames not because they were pampered, but because they were the most vulnerable to hypothermia and the least capable of generating their own body heat. A baby's survival depended entirely on external warmth sources, while elderly family members often struggled with circulation problems that made them particularly susceptible to cold-related death. Parents and healthy adults formed the next ring outward from the fire, close enough to benefit from radiant heat, but far enough to leave the warmest positions for those who needed them most. Children and adolescents were assigned positions based on their size, health, and family status. Younger children closer to warmth, older ones expected to tolerate more challenging thermal conditions, as training for adult responsibilities. But this wasn't a simple matter of age-based positioning. Pregnant women, anyone showing signs of illness, and family members recovering from injuries received priority placement regardless of their usual social standing. Medieval people understood intuitively that thermal stress could kill vulnerable individuals, and they adjusted sleeping arrangements accordingly. A household's survival depended on protecting its most fragile members. The management of the fire itself required round-the-clock attention that was distributed among family members according to a carefully organised schedule. Someone had to wake every few hours throughout the night to add fuel adjust logs and ensure the fire didn't die completely. This wasn't just about comfort. Allowing the fire to go out during extreme cold could mean the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Older children and adolescents often drew fire-tending duty as part of their household responsibilities. They learned to wake naturally during the night, add just enough fuel to maintain warmth without creating dangerous flares, and return to sleep quickly enough to preserve their own rest. This training taught them to read fire behavior, understand fuel consumption rates, and develop the light sleeping patterns that would serve them throughout their adult lives. A fascinating account from a Yorkshire manor describes the elaborate rotation system one large household developed for winter fire management. Different family members took responsibility for specific time periods throughout the night, with backup assignments for sick days and emergency situations. The system included detailed instructions for different weather conditions, more frequent tending during storms, additional fuel during extreme cold, and special protocols for managing fires when household members were travelling. Historians still debate how effectively these family fire management systems actually worked. Some argue that round-the-clock fire maintenance was feasible for large households with sufficient manpower and fuel supplies. Others suggest that many families simply accepted that fires would die during the night and focused on preservation strategies, banking coals using heated stones, and relying on body heat and blankets to survive until morning relighting was possible. The social dynamics around fire management revealed family hierarchies and relationships in intimate detail. Who was trusted with nighttime fire duties indicated their status and reliability within the household. Who received priority positioning near the warmth showed their value and vulnerability. Conflicts over fire management could tear families apart, while successful cooperation around thermal survival strengthened bonds and trust. Fuel allocation created another layer of thermal politics. Wood, peat, charcoal, or whatever combustible materials the family could obtain had to be carefully rationed to last through the winter months. Deciding how much fuel to burn each night required balancing immediate comfort against long-term survival. Families that burned too much early in the season faced the terrifying prospect of fuel shortages during the coldest months. Servants in wealthy households faced particularly complex fire management challenges. They were responsible for maintaining fires in multiple chambers, ensuring their master's comfort while managing their own survival needs. Some castle households employed specialized servants whose only job was fire management, feeding hearths throughout the night, maintaining coal supplies, and ensuring that no chamber became dangerously cold. A quirky detail from monastery records shows that some religious communities developed theological interpretations of fire-tending duties. Monks assigned to maintain altar fires and heating braziers were considered to be performing sacred service, keeping the eternal flame that represented divine presence. These spiritual firekeepers received special recognition and sometimes exemption from other duties during winter months. The consequences of fire management failures were serious enough to shape family law and customs. Households developed strict rules about fire safety, fuel conservation, and emergency procedures. Children learned early that careless fire management could kill family members, and adults who failed in their thermal responsibilities faced social consequences that extended well beyond the immediate household. Picture yourself now as part of this medieval thermal democracy, where your position relative to the fire determines your odds of surviving the night. You understand your place in the household hierarchy not by formal announcements, but by where you're permitted to sleep relative to the life-giving warmth. If you're young and healthy, you accept a position farther from the flames, knowing that your survival depends on the collective welfare of those closer to the fire. You watch the intricate dance of fire management as family members wake throughout the night to tend the flames. Each person knows their scheduled time, their specific duties, and the signs that indicate whether the fire needs immediate attention or can wait for the next rotation. This isn't just household maintenance, it's a choreographed survival ritual that's been perfected over generations of winter nights. The fire becomes the heartbeat of your sleeping space, its light casting moving shadows that mark the passage of nighttime hours. Its warmth creates zones of livability in an otherwise hostile environment, and its maintenance creates the rhythm around which your family organizes its most vulnerable hours. You fall asleep not just to the sound of crackling wood, but to the reassuring presence of a heating system that operates on human cooperation, family loyalty, and the shared understanding that everyone's survival depends on keeping that flame alive until dawn. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Now imagine that breath filled not with the sanitized air of modern bedrooms, but with the complex aromatic symphony that defined medieval sleeping spaces. The medieval bedchamber was a dense stew of odors layered from the moment you crossed the heavy wooden threshold, a sensory experience so rich and overwhelming that modern noses would require serious adjustment time to process the olfactory reality of where our ancestors spent their nights. The first scent that would hit you was always smoke. Not the pleasant camping fire smoke of modern nostalgia, but the thick, acrid smell of wood fires that had been burning continuously for months, mixing with the residue of tallow candles, oil lamps, and whatever combustible materials the household could afford. This smoke didn't dissipate. It soaked into every textile, every piece of wood, every stone surface until the entire chamber existed in a permanent cloud of aromatic combustion. Layered underneath the smoke was the unmistakable presence of unwashed wool. Medieval people wrapped themselves in wool blankets, wool clothing, wool tapestries, and wool bed curtains that rarely saw anything resembling modern washing. These textiles absorbed months of human contact moisture from breath and bodies, and the smoke from countless fires. The result was a musky, oily scent that modern people might find overwhelming, but that medieval inhabitants probably found comforting in its familiarity. Animal scents formed another crucial component of bedroom aromatics. Remember that many medieval people shared sleeping spaces with dogs, cats, and sometimes larger livestock. Even in wealthy households where animals didn't sleep directly in bedchambers, the smell of horses from stables below, dogs from the great hall, and various farm animals from nearby buildings drifted through stone corridors and wooden floors. Fur bedding contributed its own distinctive odours. Bear pelts, wolf skins, and rabbit fur all carried the scent signatures of their original owners. Human body odour was an unavoidable reality in an era when bathing was infrequent and soap was a luxury item. Medieval people changed their undergarments more often than they washed their bodies, which meant that sleeping chambers were filled with the accumulated scent of human bodies that had been working, travelling, and living without modern hygiene standards. This wasn't necessarily unpleasant to medieval sensibilities, it was simply the normal human smell that represented health and life. Food odours permeated bedchambers in ways that might surprise modern people. Eating often occurred in the same rooms where people slept, and the smells of bread ale, roasted meat, and preserved foods lingered in textiles and wooden surfaces. Herbs used for cooking and medicine, garlic, onions, various medicinal plants contributed their own aromatic layers. Some families deliberately introduced pleasant food smells into sleeping areas, burning aromatic woods or herbs to create more appealing bedroom atmospheres. A fascinating detail from household inventories shows that wealthy families invested in chamber perfumes, herbs, flowers, and aromatic substances specifically chosen to improve bedroom air quality. Lavender, rosemary, sweet woodruff, and other fragrant plants were sewn into pillows scattered among bed linens or burned in special braziers. These weren't just luxury items, they were practical attempts to manage the overwhelming sensory environment of medieval sleeping spaces. Historians still debate whether medieval people were simply accustomed to these strong odours or whether they actively worked to minimise them. Evidence suggests both approaches coexisted. Some households clearly invested significant resources in aromatic improvements, while others seem to accept whatever smells accumulated as part of normal domestic life. Cultural attitudes towards scent varied by region, social class, and personal preference. The seasonal variation in bedroom odours was dramatic and noticeable. Summer chambers smelled different from winter ones as heating methods changed, window opening patterns shifted, and humidity levels fluctuated. Spring brought the opportunity to air out textiles and replace straw bedding, creating brief periods of relatively fresh bedroom air. Autumn introduced the smells of food preservation and preparation for winter heating, while winter locked in months of accumulated odours under layers of closed curtains and sealed shutters. Medical theories of the time connected bedroom air quality directly to health outcomes. Medieval physicians believed that bad air could cause illness, while pleasant aromas could promote healing and restful sleep. This led to deliberate aromatic strategies designed to improve both sleep quality and general health. Some families burned specific herbs before bedtime, believing that inhaling certain scents would prevent nightmares or encourage prophetic dreams. Monastery records provide detailed accounts of aromatic sleep environments that religious communities deliberately created. Monks burned frankincense, myrrh, and other sacred aromatics in sleeping chambers, believing that pleasant scents would encourage holy dreams and discourage demonic influences. Some monasteries maintained herb gardens specifically for producing aromatic materials used in sleeping areas. The psychology of medieval bedroom aromatics was complex and culturally specific. Sense that modern people might find repulsive the smell of tallow candles made from animal fat, for example, were associated with light warmth and safety in medieval minds. The familiar mixture of smoke wool and human presence represented home security and successful survival in a harsh world. Picture yourself now entering a medieval bedchamber and breathing deeply of this aromatic complexity. Your first breath brings the sharp bite of wood smoke, mixed with the oily richness of wool that's absorbed months of human contact. Underneath that, you detect the musky presence of animal fur, the sweet corruption of tallow candles, and the green sharpness of herbs that someone scattered among the bed linens, hoping to encourage peaceful sleep. As you settle into this aromatic environment, your modern sensibilities might rebel initially, but gradually you begin to understand how these scents created a sensory cocoon that medieval people associated with safety and rest. The smell becomes part of the sleep experience, not just background sensation, but active aromatherapy that signaled to medieval minds that they were in a protected space where rest was possible. The chamber breathes around you with the accumulated scent signatures of all the humans and animals who've found shelter here before. Every breath connects you to the long history of people who fought the same battles against cold and darkness, who've wrapped themselves in the same aromatic textiles and fallen asleep to the same mixture of smoke wool and hope that tomorrow would bring another chance at survival. When you climbed into a medieval bed, you weren't just pulling up a blanket, you were lowering yourself under what amounted to a textile fortress designed to trap every possible ounce of body heat. The weight of medieval bedding was legendary, literally and figuratively. A properly outfitted noble bed could carry 50 to 70 pounds of covers, furs and fabrics, creating what modern people might consider a crushing burden, but what medieval sleepers understood as essential survival equipment. The layering system followed principles that would make modern outdoor gear manufacturers proud, though medieval people arrived at these techniques through centuries of cold weather trial and error rather than scientific research. The bottom layer typically consisted of linen sheets, if you were wealthy enough to afford them, that provided a barrier between skin and the rougher wool materials above. These sheets were often the only bedding that received regular washing, making them crucial for basic hygiene in an era when most textiles stayed dirty for months. Above the base layer came wool blankets in multiple weights and thicknesses. Medieval wool was different from modern processed varieties, coarser, oilier, and retaining more of the natural lanolin that helped repel moisture and maintain insulation properties. These blankets were woven tight and thick, designed to trap air and create thermal barriers that could maintain body heat even when the surrounding air temperature dropped near freezing. The outer layers provided the real thermal engineering. Fur coverlets made from beowulf deer or rabbit pelts created insulation systems that had been perfected by nature over millions of years of evolution. A bear pelt could weigh 20 pounds by itself, but that weight was distributed thermal protection that could keep a human body warm in conditions that would otherwise prove fatal. The fur trapped air close to the body while the hide provided wind-resistant protection against drafts. Quilted coverlets represented medieval high technology in textile engineering. These were constructed by sewing together multiple layers of fabric with down wool or other insulating materials trapped between them. The quilting pattern wasn't just decorative, it prevented the filling from shifting and clumping, maintaining even distribution of insulation across the entire surface. A well-made quilt could provide warmth equivalent to multiple wool blankets, while weighing significantly less. But here's where medieval bedding revealed its engineering genius. The weight wasn't a bug, it was a feature. That crushing pressure from heavy covers served multiple thermal purposes beyond simple insulation. The weight compressed the air spaces between layers, creating denser thermal barriers. It also pressed the coverings tight against the body, eliminating gaps where warm air could escape and cold air could enter. The psychological impact of heavy bedding was as important as the physical warmth. Medieval people lived with constant awareness of their vulnerability to cold and death. Being pressed down under substantial weight created feelings of security and protection that helped combat the anxiety of sleeping in hostile environments. The covers weren't just keeping you warm, they were holding you down safely against a world that seemed determined to freeze you to death. A fascinating inventory from the Duke of Berry's household in 1416 lists bed coverings that included 12 wool blankets, 4 quilted coverlets, 6 fur throws, and 2 ceremonial tapestries used as additional insulation during extreme weather. The total weight of this bedding system exceeded 80 pounds, requiring servants to help arrange and adjust the covers properly. This wasn't unusual luxury, it was standard equipment for surviving winter nights in stone castles. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually slept under all these layers simultaneously, or whether they added and removed coverings based on temperature fluctuations throughout the night. Evidence suggests both approaches were common. Some families maintained carefully organized bedding systems, where covers could be added incrementally as temperatures dropped, while others simply buried themselves under the entire pile and endured whatever thermal conditions resulted. The maintenance of heavy bedding systems required significant household resources and labor. Fur coverlets needed regular treatment to prevent moth damage and maintain their insulation properties. Wool blankets required airing and occasional cleaning to prevent them from becoming too heavily saturated with moisture and oils. Quilted coverlets needed repair when the outer fabrics wore through from the weight and pressure of use. Servants in wealthy households developed specialized skills in bedding management that went far beyond simple bed making. They learned to read weather signs and adjust covering arrangements accordingly to repair damaged textiles quickly before small problems became major failures, and to rotate heavy bedding to ensure even wear and maximum lifespan. The social implications of bedding weight were significant in medieval culture. The ability to afford and maintain heavy, high-quality bed coverings was a mark of wealth and status that communicated social position as clearly as expensive clothing or jewelry. Visitors to noble households were often specifically shown the elaborate bedding systems as demonstrations of wealth and sophisticated living standards. A quirky detail from monastery records shows that some religious communities developed theological interpretations of heavy bedding. They argued that the weight and discomfort of massive covers represented spiritual discipline and reminded sleepers of their mortality and dependence on divine protection. Whether this represented genuine spiritual insight or creative rationalization of poverty-driven bedding limitations remains unclear. Picture yourself now preparing to sleep under this medieval textile fortress. Servants help you arrange the layers in proper order, linen against your skin wool blankets for primary insulation, quilted coverlets for additional warmth, and finally the massive fur throws that will provide the outer barrier against cold air infiltration. As the covers settle into place, you feel the immediate sensation of being pressed down into the mattress by sheer weight. Your body disappears under what feels like a small mountain of textiles, furs, and fabrics. Movement becomes difficult, turning over requires planning and effort as you negotiate with 50 pounds of bedding that doesn't want to shift position easily. But gradually the thermal magic begins to work. Your body heat, trapped by all those layers and compressed by all that weight, begins to warm the air spaces between fabrics. the crushing pressure that initially felt uncomfortable transforms into a cocoon of security that holds your warmth close and keeps the hostile cold at bay. You understand viscerally why medieval people were willing to sleep under textile mountains, because once that weight settled around you and began to trap your heat, you finally felt safe from the winter night that prowled outside your chamber walls. Medieval people lived in a world where the boundary between sleeping and waking, between physical experience and spiritual reality, was far more porous than modern minds can easily comprehend. Dreams weren't just random neurological activity, they were messages, warnings, prophecies, and spiritual battlegrounds, where your soul remained active while your body rested. When you closed your eyes in a medieval bedchamber, you weren't just seeking physical rest. You were entering a realm where cold air, uncomfortable beds, and spiritual forces combined to create vivid dream experiences that required careful interpretation. The medieval understanding of dreams was deeply influenced by the physical conditions of sleep. Cold chambers, uncomfortable bedding, and the constant struggle to maintain warmth created sleep patterns that were fragmented and intense. People often woke multiple times during the night, drifting in and out of dream states that felt more real and meaningful than the brief deep sleep cycles that modern people experience in temperature-controlled environments. Church doctrine taught that dreams could come from three sources: divine inspiration, natural physical causes, or demonic interference. This meant that every dream required careful analysis to determine its spiritual significance and appropriate response. Dreaming of water might indicate purification or drowning. Dreaming of fire could represent divine inspiration or hellish temptation. A nightmare about wolves might warn of real dangers or reveal hidden sins requiring confession and penance. The physical discomfort of medieval sleeping conditions contributed directly to dream intensity and frequency. When your body was constantly fighting cold, adjusting to scratchy bedding, or responding to smoke and unusual odors, your sleep remained light and easily interrupted. This created ideal conditions for vivid dreams and frequent transitions between sleeping and waking states that medieval people interpreted as evidence of spiritual activity. Monastery records provide detailed accounts of dream interpretation practices that reveal how seriously medieval people took their nighttime visions. Monks were required to report significant dreams to their superiors, who would analyze the content for religious meaning and provide guidance for appropriate responses. Some dreams were celebrated as holy visions, while others prompted increased prayer, fasting, or other spiritual remedies. A fascinating chronicle from a Benedictine abbey describes a monk who dreamed repeatedly of sleeping in a warm, comfortable bed and interpreted this as a spiritual test of his commitment to ascetic living. The dream's appeal indicated worldly temptation that required resistance through increased devotion to poverty and discomfort. Whether the monk was genuinely struggling with spiritual issues or simply wanted a better mattress, the record doesn't specify. Historians still debate how much medieval dream interpretation reflected genuine spiritual belief versus practical attempts to find meaning in the harsh realities of uncomfortable sleep. Evidence suggests both motivations coexisted. Some people clearly experience profound spiritual meaning in their dreams, while others used religious interpretation as a way to cope with nightly discomfort and anxiety about survival. The connection between cold sleeping conditions and vivid dreams wasn't lost on medieval physicians and scholars. They understood that physical discomfort increased dream activity and sometimes prescribed specific sleeping arrangements to encourage or discourage certain types of dreams. Sleeping with your head elevated was thought to promote prophetic visions, while sleeping on your left side was believed to cause nightmares, Dream journals and records from wealthy households show that some families maintain detailed logs of family members' dreams, looking for patterns that might predict weather changes, illness, or other important events. These weren't casual observations, they were systematic attempts to use dream interpretation as practical forecasting tools for managing household and agricultural decisions. The social aspects of dream sharing created another layer of medieval sleep culture. Families often discussed their dreams around morning fires, sharing interpretations and seeking advice about appropriate responses to troubling or significant visions. Children learned early that their dreams mattered and that proper interpretation required understanding both spiritual and practical contexts. Folk medicine traditions connected specific herbs and aromatic preparations to dream enhancement or control. Lavender under the pillow was believed to promote peaceful sleep and pleasant dreams. Mugwort was thought to encourage prophetic visions. Rosemary was used to prevent nightmares and protect against demonic dream interference. These weren't just superstitions, they were practical applications of knowledge about how scents could influence sleep quality and dream content. Weather conditions and seasonal changes were believed to affect dream quality and spiritual significance. Winter dreams were considered more intense and meaningful because the harsh conditions required greater spiritual protection. Spring dreams were thought to predict upcoming agricultural success or failure. Summer dreams were considered less reliable because comfortable conditions reduce spiritual alertness. The practice of dream incubation, deliberately seeking specific types of dreams through prayer, fasting, or sleeping in particular locations, was common among both religious communities and lay people. Some individuals would sleep in churches or near religious relics, hoping to receive divine guidance through dreams. Others would fast before sleep or recite specific prayers designed to encourage prophetic visions. Picture yourself now settling into medieval sleep with the awareness that your dreams carry spiritual weight and practical significance. As you drift toward unconsciousness in your cold chamber, wrapped in scratchy wool and surrounded by the smells of smoke and animals, you understand that the vivid images and experiences about to unfold aren't just mental entertainment, they're messages that require interpretation and possibly action. The discomfort of your sleeping conditions keeps your mind alert even as your body seeks rest, creating perfect conditions for the intense, memorable dreams that medieval people considered evidence of spiritual activity. Every shift of position, every draught of cold air, every strange sound from the night becomes integrated into dream narratives that feel more real than the waking world. You wake periodically throughout the night, each awakening bringing clear memories of dream experiences that seem charged with meaning and significance. The line between sleeping and waking becomes blurred as physical discomfort and spiritual awareness combine to create a night-long journey through realms where cold air, divine messages, and personal anxieties merge into experiences that will require careful analysis when morning finally arrives. In the medieval hierarchy of suffering, no position was quite as brutally demanding as that of the servants responsible for maintaining fires throughout the night. While their masters slept buried under mountains of furs and wool, these dedicated individuals faced a schedule that would make modern shift workers weep with exhaustion, staying awake every few hours to feed flames that meant the difference between their employers waking up alive or becoming expensive frozen corpses by morning. The servant fire tending rotation was a masterpiece of sleep deprivation logistics that had to balance human endurance against thermal necessity. In wealthy households, multiple servants shared the overnight fire duties, creating a schedule that allowed each person some sleep, while ensuring that crucial heating systems never failed completely. A typical rotation might involve checking fires every 2 to 3 hours, adding fuel, adjusting dampers, and monitoring for dangerous conditions like chimney fires or overheating. But this wasn't just a matter of tossing logs into fireplaces and returning to bed. Medieval fire management required genuine expertise and constant vigilance. Servants had to understand the burning characteristics of different wood types, the proper arrangement of logs for overnight burning, and the delicate balance between maintaining heat and preventing dangerous flare-ups that could ignite chamber furnishings or clothing. The night fire servant needed to master the art of moving through dark chambers without disturbing sleeping households while carrying burning materials and performing tasks that required both precision and speed. They developed cat-like abilities to navigate familiar spaces by touch and memory, identifying the right hearths, locating fuel supplies, and managing fire tools without creating noise that would wake their masters from precious sleep. Different types of chambers required different fire management strategies that servants had to learn and remember. Great halls with massive fireplaces could handle large logs and required less frequent attention, but generated smoke and sparks that needed careful monitoring. Private bedchambers with smaller hearths burned fuel faster and required more delicate management to maintain consistent temperatures without overheating small spaces. A fascinating account from a Burgundian castle's household records describes the training program for new fire servants that included month-long apprenticeships where experienced servants taught newcomers the specific requirements of every fireplace in the castle. The training covered wood selection, proper log placement, emergency procedures for chimney fires, and the subtle art of reading fire behaviour in different weather conditions. The psychological toll of night fire duty was severe enough to affect servant health and longevity. Chronic sleep deprivation, constant exposure to smoke, and the stress of bearing responsibility for their master's survival created physical and mental health problems that medieval household managers had to address through rotation schedules and compensation adjustments. Some servants requested assignment to daytime duties specifically to escape the night fire responsibilities. Historians still debate how effectively these servant fire management systems actually functioned during extreme weather conditions. Some argue that well-organized households with adequate servant staff could maintain fires throughout even the harshest winter nights. Others suggest that servant systems often failed during severe cold, forcing families to rely on passive heat retention strategies when human endurance reached its limits. The social dynamics between fire servants and their masters created complex relationships that went beyond simple employer-employee arrangements. Servants who successfully maintained fires through dangerous nights earned positions of trust and responsibility that could lead to advancement within household hierarchies. Masters who survived harsh winters often developed genuine appreciation for servants whose vigilance had literally saved their lives. The technical skills required for overnight fire management were substantial enough that experienced fire servants could command higher wages and better working conditions than basic household staff. They needed to understand the properties of different fuels, recognize signs of dangerous chimney conditions, and respond appropriately to emergencies like house fires or carbon monoxide buildup that could kill entire households. Monastery records provide detailed accounts of religious communities' approaches to night fire management that reveal how even spiritual institutions struggled with the practical demands of keeping people alive through winter nights. Some monasteries assigned fire duty as penance for minor infractions, while others considered it sacred service that earned spiritual merit. The variation suggests that attitudes toward night fire duty reflected broader cultural values about work sacrifice and community responsibility. The seasonal variation in fire servant duties was dramatic and exhausting. Summer months might require minimal overnight fire management allowing servants to recover from winter sleep deprivation. But autumn brought the gradual increase in fire responsibilities, and winter created schedules that pushed human endurance to its limits. Spring offered hope of reduced duties, but also brought the challenge of managing fires during unpredictable weather transitions. Emergency procedures for fire servant failures were essential parts of medieval household management. When servants became ill-injured or simply collapsed from exhaustion, backup systems had to ensure that fire management continued. Some households cross-trained multiple servants in fire duties, while others developed emergency protocols that could mobilize the entire household if heating systems failed during critical periods. Picture yourself now as one of these dedicated night fire servants responsible for maintaining the heating systems that keep your wealthy masters alive through another winter night. You've managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep since your last fire tending round, and now the internal clock that servants develop from months of night duty tells you it's time for another inspection of the hearths under your care. You rise silently from your servants' quarters, gather your fire tools and fuel supplies, and begin the careful navigation through dark corridors toward the chambers where nobles sleep peacefully under their heavy covers, trusting that you'll maintain the warmth that keeps hypothermia at bay. Every step requires caution. Disturbing your master's sleep would bring punishment, but failing to maintain their fires could bring death. You enter the first chamber where your lord sleeps buried under bear pelts and wool blankets, the air thick with smoke and the sound of steady breathing. The fire has burned down to glowing coals that need immediate attention if they're going to survive until your next scheduled visit. You work quickly and quietly, adding fuel and adjusting the arrangement to ensure steady burning, knowing that this single task might be the difference between your master waking up alive or becoming another casualty of medieval winter. As you move through the castle performing these life-saving duties, you understand that your sleepless vigilance is what allows the feudal system to function. Your masters can afford to sleep soundly because your exhaustion guarantees their survival, creating a relationship of dependence that goes far beyond simple economic exchange into the realm of life and death responsibility. In the brutal calculus of medieval winter survival, children represented both the greatest vulnerability and the most precious resource that families possessed. Their small bodies generated less heat, lost warmth faster, and required constant protection from conditions that could kill them within hours. Yet these same children were the future of family lines, the inheritors of hard-won survival knowledge, and the reason adults endured unimaginable hardships. The strategies medieval families developed to keep their youngest members alive through winter nights reveal both the desperate creativity of parental love and the harsh realities of a world where childhood itself was a high-stakes gamble against the elements. The physics of child survival in medieval winters were unforgiving and required constant vigilance. Children's higher surface area to body mass ratio meant they lost heat much faster than adults, while their immature circulatory systems struggled to maintain core body temperature in extreme conditions. A child who seemed fine at bedtime could be hypothermic or dead by morning if protective measures failed. This reality shaped every aspect of medieval child-rearing during winter months. Sleeping arrangements prioritized child protection through strategic positioning and shared body heat. Infants slept directly against their mother's skin, often inside the mother's clothing, where parental body heat could maintain life-sustaining temperatures. Older children were positioned in the center of family sleeping areas surrounded by adult bodies that formed living barriers against cold air infiltration. No child slept alone during winter. That was considered tantamount to murder. The clothing and covering strategies for sleeping children were elaborate systems of layered protection that parents adjusted throughout the night. Children might be wrapped in multiple layers of wool clothing, then covered with adult-sized blankets that could be shared with parents or siblings. Some families used specialized child-sized fur wrappings or created improvised sleeping bags from animal pelts that enclosed children completely while allowing breathing space. Feeding strategies became crucial elements of child winter survival because well-fed children generated more body heat and maintained temperature regulation better than hungry ones. Parents often saved the richest, most calorie-dense foods for children during winter months, understanding that adequate nutrition was essential thermal protection. Warm milk, fatty broths, and honey-sweetened porridge weren't just comfort foods, they were life-sustaining thermal fuel. A remarkable account from a Yorkshire manor court describes a family dispute over child sleeping arrangements that reveals how seriously medieval people took these survival protocols. One mother accused her sister-in-law of endangering a child by allowing him to sleep too far from the fire during a harsh cold snap. The court took the complaint seriously enough to investigate and establish formal guidelines for child positioning during extreme weather. Medieval people developed sophisticated observation skills for monitoring child health and safety during cold nights. Parents learned to recognize the early signs of hypothermia in children, changes in breathing patterns, skin color variations, and behavioral indicators that suggested a child was losing the battle against cold. These skills were passed down through generations as essential parental knowledge. The psychological aspects of protecting children during winter nights created family dynamics that modern parents might find overwhelming. Adults often sacrificed their own comfort entirely to ensure child survival, giving up warm sleeping positions, sharing their personal blankets, and maintaining vigilant watch throughout the night. Sleep became a luxury that parents couldn't afford when children's lives hung in the balance. Historians still debate how successful these child protection strategies actually were during extreme winter conditions. Medieval mortality records suggest that child death rates increased dramatically during harsh winters, but they also show that families with adequate resources and knowledge could successfully protect most of their children through even severe cold spells. The strategies worked, but they required constant vigilance and significant resource allocation. Community support systems often mobilized around child protection during winter crises. Neighbors shared fuel, food, and even sleeping space when families faced situations that threatened child survival. Village communities understood that protecting children was a collective responsibility that ensured the community's future survival and prosperity. The training of older children in winter survival skills began early and intensively. Children as young as 5 or 6 learn to recognize dangerous cold conditions, understand the signs of hypothermia in younger siblings, and assist with family heating and protection strategies. This education was considered as essential as any other childhood learning because it could mean the difference between family survival and destruction. Religious practices often focus specifically on child protection during winter months. Families said special prayers for child safety, made offerings at shrines dedicated to protecting young people, and performed rituals designed to invoke divine protection against winter dangers. These spiritual practices provided psychological comfort for parents who understood how little control they had over their children's survival. Medical knowledge about child cold injury was limited but practical. Medieval people understood that children with frostbite required gradual warming, that hypothermic children needed immediate skin-to-skin contact with warm adults, and that children who stopped shivering were in immediate mortal danger. This knowledge was shared among women through informal networks that transmitted life-saving information across communities. The seasonal rhythm of child protection created annual cycles of anxiety and relief that shaped family emotional patterns. Autumn brought increasing worry as parents prepared for another winter of vigilant child protection. Winter meant months of constant alertness and sleep deprivation, as adults monitored children throughout long, dangerous nights. Spring arrival brought profound relief and gratitude that another generation had survived to continue the family line. Picture yourself now as a medieval parent facing the nightly challenge of keeping your children alive through another winter night. You arrange the sleeping area with military precision, the baby tucked inside your clothing, where your body heat can maintain her core temperature. Your 5-year-old son positioned between you and your spouse, where adult bodies can shield him from drafts. Your 8-year-old daughter, covered with extra blankets and positioned closest to the fire. Throughout the night you wake repeatedly to check breathing, adjust coverings, and ensure that small bodies are maintaining adequate warmth. Your own comfort becomes irrelevant as you focus entirely on the life-sustaining task of thermal protection for the most vulnerable family members. Sleep becomes fragmented and shallow as parental vigilance overrides personal exhaustion. You understand viscerally that your children's survival depends entirely on your knowledge, preparation, and sleepless dedication. Every decision about positioning, covering, and monitoring could determine whether morning brings relief or tragedy. This isn't just parenting, it's a life and death responsibility that shapes every moment of winter nights and creates bonds of mutual dependence that define medieval family relationships. As darkness settled over medieval households and families prepared for the nightly battle against cold and death, the rituals surrounding sleep took on profound spiritual significance that went far beyond simple bedtime routines. Medieval people understood that sleep was a vulnerable state where the soul remained active while the body lay defenseless, creating a liminal space between the physical and spiritual worlds that required careful protection through prayer ritual and divine intervention. The evening prayers said before sleep weren't casual requests for peaceful rest. They were urgent appeals for survival through another night that might bring death, spiritual attack, or prophetic visions requiring divine guidance. Families gathered around dying fires to recite specific prayers designed to invoke angelic protection, ward off demonic influences, and ensure that if death came during the night, their souls would be prepared for judgment. The Catholic Church provided formal prayer cycles specifically designed for bedtime protection that addressed both physical and spiritual dangers. The Compline prayers, traditionally the final religious service of the day, included specific requests for protection during sleep, peaceful dreams, and safe awakening. Many families adapted these formal prayers for household use, creating personalized versions that addressed their specific fears and circumstances. Medieval people believed that the transition from waking to sleeping created a window of vulnerability, where evil forces could attack both body and soul. The moments of falling asleep were considered particularly dangerous, because consciousness was diminished while spiritual awareness might be heightened. Families developed elaborate protective rituals designed to shield sleepers during these vulnerable transition periods. Blessing the sleeping space itself became an essential component of nighttime spiritual protection. Parents would make the sign of the cross over children's beds, sprinkle holy water around sleeping areas, and recite protective formulas that invoked saints known for their power against nighttime dangers. These weren't just comforting gestures, they were serious attempts to create spiritually protected zones where families could rest safely. The placement of religious objects around sleeping areas followed specific traditions that connected physical protection with spiritual security. Crucifixes were positioned where sleepers could see them immediately upon waking, creating visual reminders of divine protection and helping orient confused minds emerging from potentially troubling dreams. Holy relics, blessed herbs, and sacred images created protective barriers that medieval people believed could repel both natural and supernatural threats. A fascinating collection of bedtime prayers from a 14th century English prayer book reveals the specific anxieties that medieval people brought to their nightly spiritual preparations. The prayers request protection from the terrors of the night, evil dreams and fantasies, sudden death in sleep, and the snares of the ancient enemy. These weren't abstract theological concerns, they reflected real fears about what might happen during the vulnerable hours of darkness. Historians still debate how much medieval bedtime spirituality reflected genuine religious devotion versus practical psychological coping mechanisms for dealing with nightly survival anxiety. Evidence suggests both motivations were deeply intertwined spiritual practices, provided both theological comfort and practical stress management for people facing genuine physical dangers every night. The seasonal variation in bedtime spiritual practices was significant and revealed how medieval people connected physical and spiritual survival. Winter prayers were longer, more urgent, and focused specifically on protection from cold starvation and death. Summer prayers were shorter and emphasized gratitude for survival and requests for continued protection. Spring and autumn prayers addressed the spiritual challenges of seasonal transitions and changing survival requirements. Children learned bedtime spiritual practices as early as they could speak, understanding that prayer was as essential for survival as warm clothing or adequate food. Parents taught specific prayers for different types of protection prayers against nightmares, prayers for warm weather, prayers for family safety, and prayers for peaceful death if survival wasn't possible. This spiritual education was considered as important as any practical survival training. Folk spiritual practices often blended with official church teachings to create household traditions that addressed local concerns and cultural beliefs. Families might recite traditional prayers while also performing folk rituals like hanging protective herbs, drawing protective symbols, or reciting formulas passed down through family traditions. These hybrid practices reflected the integration of formal religion with practical spiritual protection. The morning prayers of thanksgiving for surviving another night were as important as evening protective prayers, and revealed the genuine relief that medieval people felt upon successful completion of nighttime survival challenges. Families would gather to thank God for protection, received acknowledge specific mercies experienced during the night, and request continued divine assistance for the day ahead. The community aspects of bedtime spiritual practices created shared traditions that strengthened social bonds and collective resilience. Entire villages might participate in evening prayer services during particularly dangerous periods, creating communal spiritual protection that complemented individual family practices. These community rituals reinforced the understanding that survival was both individual and collective responsibility. Monastic communities developed the most elaborate nighttime spiritual practices with formal services that divided night hours into specific prayer periods. Monks would rise multiple times during the night for prayers that acknowledged the spiritual significance of darkness, while requesting divine protection for themselves and their communities. These practices influenced lay bedtime spirituality and provided models for household religious observance. The connection between physical survival strategies and spiritual protection was seamless in medieval thinking. Maintaining fires, arranging protective bedding, and organizing family sleeping positions were understood as cooperation with divine providence rather than purely human efforts. People believed that God helped those who helped themselves, making practical preparation and spiritual devotion equally essential for survival. Picture yourself now participating in these medieval bedtime spiritual rituals as your family prepares for another potentially dangerous night. You gather around the dying fire with your children and spouse reciting prayers that acknowledge both your gratitude for surviving another day and your desperate need for divine protection through the hours ahead. The words of the prayers connect your immediate physical concerns, staying warm, breathing safely, waking alive with eternal spiritual realities about divine mercy, angelic protection, and the constant presence of both good and evil forces in the world. As you speak these ancient formulas, you feel the comfort of joining your voice to generations of families who face the same nightly fears and found strength in shared spiritual practices. The blessing of sleeping spaces and the placement of sacred objects create a sense of spiritual architecture that complements the physical protection of walls, fires, and warm bedding. You understand that survival requires both practical preparation and divine assistance, making bedtime prayers as essential as heated stones or heavy blankets for ensuring that morning will bring relief rather than tragedy. As the first pale light of dawn begins to filter through the heavy shutters of your medieval chamber, you experience what might be the most profound relief known to human civilization, the simple, overwhelming joy of discovering that you have survived another night. In the medieval world, morning wasn't just the start of a new day. It was proof that you had successfully navigated the treacherous passage between sunset and sunrise, emerging victorious from a nightly battle that claimed countless lives throughout the long centuries of human struggle against winter's relentless assault. The awakening process itself was a careful ritual that acknowledged both gratitude for survival and the need to preserve the warmth that had sustained life through the dark hours. You don't simply leap from bed in medieval mornings. Instead, you emerge gradually from your textile fortress, testing the air temperature, assessing your body's condition, and planning your transition from the protected microclimate of your bedding to the hostile environment of the chamber beyond. Your first conscious thought isn't about the day's responsibilities or personal concerns. It's the primitive, fundamental recognition that you are alive, that your heart continues beating, that your breath creates clouds in the frigid air, and that the heating strategies, protective clothing, and cooperative warmth of family and animals have successfully carried you through another potential encounter with death. This daily survival victory never becomes routine because medieval people understand how precarious their hold on life really is. The sounds of morning in a medieval castle or cottage represent a symphony of survival success that modern ears can barely appreciate. You hear the stirring of family members in their bedding, the shifting of animals that have shared the night's warmth, the careful movements of servants beginning their morning fire-building duties. Each sound confirms that the household's thermal protection systems have functioned successfully, and that the community of living beings has endured together through another dangerous passage. Temperature assessment becomes the first practical task of medieval morning routine, as you determine whether the chamber conditions will support safe movement or whether additional warming strategies are needed before leaving the protection of heavy bedding. You test the air with exposed skin, observe the fog of your breath, and check for signs of ice formation that might indicate particularly brutal overnight conditions requiring extra caution. The gratitude expressed in morning prayers reflects genuine appreciation for divine protection that has preserved life through real danger rather than abstract theological acknowledgement. Medieval morning prayers thank God for specific mercies, warmth, preserved breath, sustained family members alive, fires maintained, and protection received against the genuine threats that prowl through winter nights seeking opportunities to claim human lives. Physical assessment reveals how well your body has weathered the nightly challenge of maintaining core temperature and basic biological function under extreme stress. You check for signs of cold injury, evaluate your energy levels, and determine whether the night's survival strategies have left you capable of facing the day's survival challenges, or whether recovery and additional warming are needed before beginning daily activities. The beginning of fire restoration represents the start of another daily cycle of thermal management that will determine whether the coming night brings survival success or potential disaster. Morning fire building isn't just about comfort. It's about beginning the complex process of fuel management, heat distribution, and thermal preparation that must be sustained throughout the day to ensure adequate protection when darkness returns. The sharing of night survival experiences creates family and community bonding that strengthens the social cooperation essential for ongoing survival success. Families discuss dreams, share observations about thermal strategies that worked or failed, and plan adjustments to sleeping arrangements based on the previous night's performance. These conversations aren't casual morning chat, they're survival debriefings that inform critical decision-making. The recognition of successful heating partnerships acknowledges the crucial contributions of animal servants and family members, whose thermal cooperation has enabled community survival. Medieval mornings include appreciation for the dogs that shared warmth, the servants who maintained fires, the family members who provided body heat, and all the cooperative relationships that made survival possible. Assessment of survival resources determines whether adequate fuel, food, and materials remain to support another night's survival challenge, or whether emergency conservation measures must be implemented immediately. Medieval people understand that survival success requires constant evaluation of resource levels and strategic planning for ongoing thermal protection needs. The psychological transition from survival mode to daily activity mode represents a complex emotional shift from the primitive fear and vigilance required for nighttime survival to the different types of awareness needed for daytime productivity and social function. This transition requires time and conscious effort as medieval minds adjust from life and death focus to broader concerns. The planning of daily activities includes consideration of how daytime choices will affect evening survival preparation, ensuring that work, travel, and social activities leave adequate time and energy for the thermal preparation that nighttime survival demands. Medieval people never fully escape awareness of the coming night's survival challenges. As you move through this medieval morning routine, you understand that survival isn't just about making it through individual nights. It's about building the knowledge, relationships, and resources that enable ongoing success in the endless cycle of nightly survival challenges. Each morning, victory provides lessons and strength for facing the next night's potential dangers. You recognize that you are part of an unbroken chain of human survival success that stretches back through countless generations of ancestors who faced similar challenges and found ways to persist. Your morning survival represents both personal victory and contribution to the continuing human story of adaptation, cooperation, and determination to survive regardless of environmental hostility. The dawn light gradually transforms your chamber from a nighttime survival shelter back into a daytime living space, but you carry with you the profound understanding that evening will bring another transformation back into survival mode. Medieval life operates on this constant cycle of preparation, protection, survival, recovery, and renewed preparation that shapes every aspect of human existence. As you finally emerge fully from your bedding and begin the day's activities, you carry with you the deep satisfaction of another survival victory and the quiet confidence that comes from mastering the ancient human art of staying alive through the long, cold nights that have challenged our species since the beginning of time. and slowly, gradually your breathing deepens. The medieval world fades like morning mist, and you find yourself back in your own warm, safe bed surrounded by the gentle hum of modern heating systems and the soft glow of electric lights. You've travelled through time and returned carrying with you the profound appreciation for warmth, shelter, and the simple miracle of waking up alive that sustained our ancestors through the countless winter nights of human history. You understand now that the bed beneath you, the roof above you, and the heat surrounding you represent victories in humanity's longest war, the battle against cold and darkness that has shaped our civilization, our families, and our deepest understanding of what it means to survive together. Rest now knowing that you are part of this ancient story of human persistence, and that your own peaceful sleep honours the memory of all those who fought the cold so that you might rest in warmth. The castle grows quiet, the fires burn low, and in the gentle darkness of modern comfort you drift towards sleep with new appreciation for the gift of easy rest and the profound human journey that brought us from stone chambers and shared animal warmth to the simple miracle of a warm, safe bed on a quiet night. The wind outside forgets your name, the fire does not speak but it listens, and the chamber sleeps holding within its ancient stones the memory of all who sought warmth here before, and the promise that morning will always return to those who endure the night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.